first cosmonauts and astronauts were launched into space, and then I began to dream about maybe that would be the ultimate experience for a pilot.
The moon was supposed to be silent, lifeless, empty. That's the story the world accepted for more than half a century. But what if the astronauts who walked across its surface saw something they were never truly allowed to explain? What if the most important discovery in human history was hidden behind carefully chosen words, edited recordings, and decades of silence? Because now, Apollo astronaut Charles Duke is beginning to speak in a way that's making people deeply uncomfortable. Not with dramatic confessions or science fiction claims, but with strange details, emotional reactions, and fragments of memory that don't fit the official narrative we've heard since 1969. The deeper researchers dig into old interviews, mission transcripts, and private conversations, the clearer one thing becomes. Something about the moon changed these men forever. Before we expose what Charles Duke may have witnessed up there, hit like and subscribe, because some discoveries were never meant to reach the public. Duke described the moon as far more overwhelming than NASA's polished broadcasts ever revealed. The silence felt unnatural. The horizon looked wrong. Distances behaved strangely. And during moments that were supposed to be routine, astronauts reportedly experienced a feeling they struggled to describe, as if they were being watched from a place where no life should exist. Over the years, tiny inconsistencies began surfacing between public statements and later reflections. Most people ignored them. But now, with modern analysis revisiting archived footage and forgotten recordings, those hidden cracks are becoming impossible to dismiss. And if Charles Duke is finally revealing even part of the truth, then the moon may not be the barren rock we were told it was. The moon NASA hid. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Charles Duke is. This matters because what he's claiming is extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require us to consider the source very carefully. Charles Duke grew up in South Carolina, the son of a naval officer. He was fascinated by flight from the time he could walk, earning his pilot's license while still in high school. He attended the Naval Academy, became an Air Force pilot, then a test pilot. This was the traditional path for astronauts in the 1960s. The men NASA selected weren't dreamers or adventurers looking for thrills. They were engineers and test pilots who understood complex systems and followed protocols exactly. I'm astronaut Charlie Duke. I was lunar module pilot on Apollo 16. They were chosen specifically because they didn't panic, didn't exaggerate, and didn't let imagination override observation. Duke was recruited into the astronaut program in 1966 as part of the fifth group selected by NASA. He quickly built a reputation for being calm, under pressure, technically brilliant, and utterly reliable. His first major role came during Apollo 11, the first moon landing. Duke served as Capcom, the capsule communicator, the voice from Houston that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin heard during humanity's most historic moment. When the lunar module touched down, it was Duke's voice that responded. "Roger, tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." That was Charles Duke. Calm, professional, focused entirely on the mission. No drama, no emotion beyond relief that his colleagues had survived. 3 years later, Duke got his own chance. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972. Duke, along with Commander John Young and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly, spent 11 days in space. Duke and Young spent 71 hours on the moon itself, longer than any previous mission. The official objectives were purely scientific. They were to explore the Descartes Highlands, collect samples from what geologists believed might be volcanic terrain, test new equipment, and conduct experiments. Everything was planned to the minute. Everything had a purpose. Everything was designed to advance human knowledge of the lunar surface, and they accomplished it all. The mission was perfect by every measurable standard. But if you watch the footage from Apollo 16 carefully, if you really pay attention, you can see something odd. There are moments where Duke stops moving entirely. He just stands there, completely still, staring at something off camera. Young's voice comes over the radio asking if he's okay. Duke responds, but there's a delay, a hesitation that doesn't match his usual crisp communication style. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just looking." "Okay. Was that one?" "Okay. Stand by for a feedwater tone." "That's what I'm looking for." Looking at what? The official transcripts don't say. The mission reports don't mention it. And for 40 years, neither did Duke. When Apollo 16 splashed down on April 27, 1972, Duke and his crewmates were treated as heroes. Ticker tape parades, a White House visit, a world tour. Duke gave hundreds of interviews over the following years, speaking about the technical aspects of the mission, the geology, the experiments, the beauty of Earth seen from space. But he never talked about what he actually saw. The experiences that didn't fit the scientific framework NASA was presenting to the world. The anomalies that would have made him sound crazy if he'd mentioned them in 1972. Duke left NASA in 1975. He became a businessman, a speaker, a devout Christian who talked openly about how his faith had been affected by seeing Earth from space. He was open about his life, his struggles, and his beliefs, but about certain things that happened on the moon, Duke stayed quiet. He gave safe interviews about safe topics. He let people believe the official story was the complete story, until he decided he was too old to stay silent anymore. The silence breaks. The change started around 2015, when Duke was in his 80s. He began giving interviews that went beyond the standard Apollo storytelling. He started using different language, talking about things he had carefully avoided for 4 decades. At first, the revelations seemed minor, strange details that could be explained away. But as the years passed, Duke became more explicit, more willing to describe experiences that would have ended his career if he'd mentioned them in the 1970s. He talked about the light being wrong, not just different from Earth light, but wrong in ways that violated basic physics. Sunlight on the moon should be pure white, maybe slightly yellow. There is no atmosphere to scatter it. That's elementary science. But Duke described seeing colors that shouldn't exist on the lunar surface, blues and purples that weren't reflections, weren't artifacts of his visor. "I could see the deep blue of the Atlantic, fading into the light blue of the atmosphere, into the blackness of space. The light itself was colored, and it would shift while he watched. He'd look away and look back, and the colors would be different." He reported this at the time, mentioned it to Houston, but it was never included in any official documentation. He talked about sounds. This is where his account becomes genuinely disturbing, because there cannot be sound on the moon. No atmosphere means no medium for sound waves to travel through. Every astronaut knew this. It was basic physics, but Duke heard things, not through the radio, not mechanical sounds from his suit's systems. He heard tones, frequencies, sometimes harmonic, like music, sometimes discordant and uncomfortable. He asked John Young if he heard it too. Young did. They both heard sounds that were physically impossible, and they didn't report it because they knew nobody would believe them. They knew it would raise questions about their mental fitness that could end their careers and taint the entire mission. He talked about the feeling of being watched. This is something Duke says every astronaut who walked on the moon will confirm, if they're being honest. You feel observed on the lunar surface, not by Houston. That's a different sensation entirely. You feel like there's attention on you from somewhere else, a presence, an awareness. Not threatening exactly, but enormous, like standing in front of something vast that has noticed you and is paying attention to what you're doing. Duke described it as being a specimen under a microscope, except the microscope was the size of the universe. He described moments where time seemed to behave strangely. The Apollo missions had strict schedules, every minute accounted for. But Duke experienced periods where he'd be working on a task, completely focused, and suddenly realized that according to his suit timer, 20 minutes had passed when it felt like 2, or the reverse. A task that should take 5 minutes would feel like it lasted an hour. Young experienced the same distortions. They'd compare notes privately, and their subjective experience of time never matched the objective clocks, not once during their entire stay on the moon. These weren't the confused ramblings of an elderly man losing his grip on reality. Duke was specific in his descriptions. He was consistent across multiple interviews over several years. He provided technical details that only someone who had actually been there could know, and he wasn't alone. In 2017, Duke attended a private reunion of Apollo astronauts, one of the rare occasions when most of the surviving moonwalkers were in the same room. According to Duke, they had a conversation that night that they'd never had publicly, a conversation about what they had actually experienced on the moon. Everyone had anomalies, Duke said afterward. Different things for different missions, but nobody's experience matched what NASA told the public. We all knew we couldn't talk about it, not because NASA threatened us, they didn't, but because we knew nobody would believe us, or worse, they would think we were crazy. So we kept quiet, all of us, for decades. Structures. The most explosive revelation came in a 2019 interview when Duke was 84 years old. The interviewer asked him directly whether he had seen anything on the moon that NASA has never acknowledged. Duke's answer was immediate. Yes, absolutely, yes. The interviewer asked what he had seen. There was a long pause. You could see Duke weighing his words, deciding how much to reveal, knowing that what he was about to say would change how people saw him forever. Then he spoke. Structures, not natural formations, not rocks that happen to look geometric. Structures, artificial, old, very old. There's a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. The interviewer, clearly not expecting this answer, asked where. Duke explained that they were in the highlands, on the far side of a ridge, out of direct line of sight from Earth. They had driven the lunar rover about 6 kilometers from the lunar module. They were supposed to be collecting samples from a specific crater when Duke saw something on the horizon, something geometric, too regular to be natural. He called it out to Young. Young saw it too. They drove closer. It wasn't on their planned route, but astronauts had some discretion for scientific discoveries. As they approached, they could see it more clearly. Duke described it as looking like a wall or a foundation, angular, made of blocks, covered in lunar dust, but definitely constructed. Maybe 100 meters long, extending into the lunar surface at both ends, as if they were seeing just a small portion of something much larger buried beneath the regolith. The interviewer asked if they reported it. Duke said they tried. They called Houston and described exactly what they were seeing. There was a long delay, much longer than the usual communication lag. Then they were told to continue with their planned sample collection. No acknowledgement of what they'd reported, no request for photographs, no excitement, no curiosity, nothing. They were experienced enough to understand what that meant. Houston didn't want them pursuing it. The interviewer asked if they took photos anyway. Duke almost laughed. Of course we took photos. Dozens of them. Close-ups, context shots, everything. They were all on the film we brought back. The interviewer asked where those photos are now. Duke's expression changed, harder, angrier. Those photos were never released. Not to the public, not to the scientific community. I've asked NASA about them multiple times over the years. I'm always told they're classified for technical reasons, or they were lost, or they were too poor quality to release. But I took those photos. They were perfectly clear, and they showed exactly what we saw. Artificial structures on the moon. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of Duke's account. The interviewer asked if the structures looked recent. Duke shook his head slowly. No, that's the thing. They looked ancient, eroded, even though there's no weather on the moon. Covered in impact craters, which meant they'd been there for a very long time. Millions of years, possibly. They predated anything humans have ever built. They predated humans entirely. The implication hung in the air like something solid. The interviewer finally asked the obvious question. So, who built them? Duke's answer was quiet but certain. I don't know. That's what makes this so difficult. I don't know. But someone or something built structures on the moon long before we got there, and NASA knows about it, and they have decided the public shouldn't. The evidence. After this interview became public, Duke faced exactly what he'd feared for 40 years. Mockery, dismissal. Mainstream media largely ignored his claims or treated them as the ramblings of an elderly man seeking attention before he died. Skeptics said he was misremembering, that decades had distorted his recollections, that the extreme environment of the moon had created false memories, that cosmic radiation had damaged his brain in ways that only manifested later in life. But Duke didn't recant. He didn't walk back his statements. Instead, he provided more details. He described other anomalies beyond the structures, areas where the lunar dust seemed to have been disturbed recently, too recently to match any natural process. Trails or paths that suggested movement across the surface. Glints of metal or glass in crater walls that didn't match any known lunar geology. He talked about how certain areas felt different. You'd cross an invisible boundary, and the sense of presence would intensify or disappear completely, like walking through rooms in a house. Each one has a different feeling, even though it's all the same structure. He described radio interference that didn't match any known source. Brief transmissions on frequencies that should have been completely silent. We heard bursts of sound. Not voices, not mechanical, almost musical. NASA said it was probably reflections from Earth broadcasts. But we were on the far side of the moon. Nothing from Earth should have reached us there. The physics don't allow it. Most strangely, Duke described moments of what he called clarity. A few times, usually when I was alone, away from John, I would suddenly understand things. Not thoughts in words, just knowledge about the moon, about its history, about why we were there. And then it would fade, and I couldn't hold on to it. But in those moments, I knew. I absolutely knew. We were being allowed to be there. We were guests. The moon was not empty. It never had been. These claims sound like science fiction. They sound like the plot of a movie, not testimony from a decorated Air Force brigadier general, a test pilot with thousands of flight hours, an astronaut who performed flawlessly on one of history's most complex missions, a man known throughout his career for being rational, skeptical, and utterly honest. Was Charles Duke losing his mind, or was he finally telling a truth he'd been forced to hide for half a century? The question became more complicated when other astronauts started making similar admissions. Buzz Aldrin, in a 2018 interview, mentioned a monolith on Mars's moon Phobos. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith. He pointedly asked why nobody seemed curious about what put it there. Edgar Mitchell had spoken for years about government knowledge of extraterrestrial intelligence before his death. Al Worden, Apollo 15's command module pilot, stated publicly that he believed humans were descendants of ancient aliens. These weren't fringe figures desperate for attention. These were men who had been to space, who had been trusted with billion-dollar missions, who had performed flawlessly under pressures most humans will never experience. And in their later years, free from NASA employment, no longer concerned about careers or reputations, they were all saying variations of the same thing. The official story is incomplete. There are things about the moon, about space, about our place in the cosmos that the public has never been told. The truth no one knows what to do with. For decades, people assumed the biggest secret about the moon was whether we actually landed there. But according to Charles Duke, the real mystery is far stranger than that. It's not about fake missions. It's about hidden uncertainty, about discoveries so confusing that even the people who found them didn't know what to do next. In a quiet 2023 interview, Duke was asked the question NASA has faced for generations. Was there a cover-up? His answer wasn't dramatic. In fact, that's exactly what made it disturbing. He said he doesn't believe in shadowy groups controlling the truth from underground bunkers. What he described was something far more believable and far more dangerous. Before we uncover why astronauts may have stayed silent for decades, hit like and subscribe, because some truths are buried not to protect lies, but to protect the world from uncertainty. Duke explained that NASA may have gathered images, recordings, and observations during the Apollo missions that simply didn't fit the official explanation of the moon as a dead, lifeless world. And when an institution is built on certainty, admitting we don't understand this becomes almost impossible. So instead of releasing confusing evidence, the material gets ignored, archived, or quietly pushed aside. Then Duke said something that stunned listeners. He admitted he never saw active life on the moon, but he believes something intelligent may once have existed there long ago, something capable of building structures that could survive for millions of years. He acknowledged how unbelievable it sounds, but said that once you witness things with your own eyes, disbelief stops mattering. What makes this harder to dismiss is that similar details appear across multiple Apollo accounts. Different astronauts, different missions, yet the same uneasy feeling kept returning. Strange silence, unnatural landscapes, moments they struggled to explain publicly. And now, at the end of his life, Charles Duke says he no longer cares about protecting reputations. He only cares about the truth. Because maybe the scariest possibility isn't that NASA lied to us. Maybe it's that they found something they still can't explain.